Okay, so in order to understand this next section, we have to understand a little bit about how dominant seventh chords normally work. And since the Lydian dominant scale is a dominant sound, as in it creates a dominant seventh chord, it's going to be useful to understand how these dominant sevenths function in a standard context. Now, you'll be very familiar with this sound. It's what we call a cadence or a resolution. Okay. Now, what we've got going on here is a G7 going to a C chord, a C major triad. This kind of thing. We've heard it a million times before. I very much doubt you've ever heard a piece of pop music that doesn't have that kind of resolution in. Perhaps not quite in that context, but something similar to that, that kind of resolution. Now, what's going on there is that we've got a dominant seventh chord that we'll call it chord 5, and I'll explain why in a minute, leading through to a chord 1, a C major in this case, so G7 leading through to C major. And what we actually have here is if we lay out all the chords of the C major scale, the fifth chord that we get is a dominant seventh, in this case G7, so C, D, E, F, G, fifth chord, and the first chord in the key is C major, so C is 1, okay? Now, dominant seventh chords only occur once within a key. So the only time we'll find a dominant seventh is on that fifth degree of the scale, in this case the G. So there's no other dominant seventh chord in the key. And the dominant seventh chord in the key leads beautifully into that 1 chord. So whenever we hear that G7, all our ears want to do is hear that 1 chord. It creates tension that leads us through to the 1 chord. So tension and then resolution. So here's the tension, and here's the resolution. So normally what dominant seventh chords do, without going too deep into the theory of which chords come from the major scale and all of that stuff, hopefully some of you guys already know that, is dominant seventh chords usually create tension and then resolve, okay, to a 1 chord usually. They can do other things as well, but generally they resolve to a 1 chord. So we generally have 5 to 1. That could happen in any key. If I did it in the key of E flat major, we would have 5, B flat 7 to E flat major, 1. Sounds the same, it's a tension, resolution. There's loads of ways we could play that. I could have played, okay, tension, resolution. Can we do that one more time? Tension, resolution, okay, 5 to 1. And that's the big thing that dominant seventh chords usually do. They usually set up this tension to resolution. Okay, now, have a look at the root movement that we get when we have tension to resolution. Here we get G going up to C. Okay, so the root movement, G to C, it does this. It goes, there's the G, 3rd fret of the low E. It goes up a string on the same fret to C. Now when it does that, that's the interval of a perfect fourth going up from G to C. Now you can either learn it as that sound, a perfect fourth, or you can look at it visually and say, okay, well if I go up on the same fret, if I go up a string towards or down a string towards the floor but up in pitch, that's a perfect fourth interval. Okay, that's what we call a resolution. Okay, so 5 to 1. Okay, so there you can hear that resolution. If I was to play my G just here at the 5th fret of the D string and play my dominant 7th shape, now when I resolve, now look what's happening to my root movement. I'm going from G here down to C. Okay, in this context, I'm going down a fifth, down a perfect fifth. That's what this is known as. It's down a string and then back 2 frets. Now we end up with the same results. If we start on this G and go up a fourth, we get resolution. If we start on this G and go down a fifth, we get the same thing, G going down to C, resolution. So what we've got here, excuse me, is if our root note of the dominant 7th goes up a fourth or down a fifth, same thing, they make exactly the same same effect. If I could go down a fifth to another string, I'd be going down to a C, okay? So it just so happens we don't have another string. We end up with this tension resolution, 5 to 1. So whenever you see root movement that does this, or you know you've got a resolving dominant 7th. Okay, that's really important, a resolving dominant 7th. Okay. Any other type of dominant seventh that doesn't do that, it doesn't have that root movement up a fourth or down a fifth, is a non-resolving dominant. Let me show you an example. If we're in the key of C and we have C major as our C major chord, and then we have a D9 chord, D7 with a ninth. Okay, so have a look at if I've switched between those two chords. Here's the sound. Now you may notice that when I go from D9 back to C, the root movement doesn't go up a fourth or down a fifth. If it did, it would go to G. It goes down 2 frets back to C. Now in that context, we can play a Lydian dominant scale over that chord, because the Lydian dominant is a non-resolving dominant chord. There's two types. There's a resolving dominant, don't play Lydian dominant, the scale. And there's a non-resolving dominant, play Lydian dominant. It's like a flow chart. Does the chord resolve up a fourth or down a fifth? If it says yes, you don't play Lydian dominant. If it says no, then you do play Lydian dominant, okay? Non-resolving dominants. And this D9 is a non-resolving dominant, okay? So we can play Lydian dominant over it, and that's really important, okay? Now, to demonstrate that, as usual, I'm gonna play that little groove for you and let you hear this in context. And obviously I'm gonna play C major over this, or I can play A minor pentatonic, that's the relative minor. Or I could play a C major pentatonic, and then over the D9, I'm gonna play a D Lydian dominant scale. So what I'm saying to you is, if you see a dominant 7th chord, or a dominant 9, or if you see a 7 sharp 11, or if you see a 9 sharp 11 or a 13 chord, and it's when you look at the chord that comes after it, it doesn't resolve up a fourth or down a fifth in terms of its root movement, then you're in business. Play Lydian dominant. Of course, just as with previous examples, if it contains some kind of natural fourth, or if it's got altered tones in it, flat 9, sharp 9, flat 5, sharp 5, it's no good to you. Don't play it, okay? You've got to play something else, and that's not why we're here, to learn all that stuff, but this is just the Lydian dominant scale, okay? So let's play that groove and have a listen to how it sounds in context with the scales, okay? Okay, so you'll find tons of examples of these non-resolving dominants. And the one I want to show you that's going to be really useful to you is involved in the blues progression. This is going to kind of be the culmination of our studies for this particular course, because we're getting quite long now. There's a lot of information to digest. But the blues is a great opportunity to use the Lydian dominant scale in a non-resolving context. And I'll try and show you why that's the case now. So we'll move on now and have a look at the blues progression. We'll do it in the key of G, and I'll show you a couple of different places you can use this Lydian dominant and why it works. So let's do that now.